What's up, guys? Welcome back. You know, next episode Challenger appears and we have this unholy abomination of a deck. This is actually a real list from 2002, so pretty much the early years of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'll leave like the original link in the video description, right? OCG, by the way, since by the time we actually got, well, it's obviously Makyura, I'll call it OTK, because it's not really an FTK, even though you're kind of, well, yeah, basically an FTK, because you're finishing off your opponent during your first turn, basically by, you know, using the combination of Makyura, the Destructor, pre-errata, by the way, with the combination of you know, the trap card that like reverses both graveyards and decks, of course. Exchange of the Spirit, right? Or also a very old school card. OCG, because again, by the time we actually got these cards, and I'm mainly looking for, or looking towards, or looking at Makyura the Destructor, the deck wasn't really too consistent anymore, since, as you see here, the thing, the strategy behind the deck is pretty self-explanatory, because you need to send Makyura the Destructor to your graveyard, and it doesn't really matter how. It can be directly from your deck, it can be from your hand by discarding it, let's say, you know, off of Morphing Jar, Graceful Charity, Card Destruction, or Painful Choice directly from your deck to the graveyard. I mean, as you saw, I mean, you're playing so many potential ways to trigger, or you activate, kind of activate Makyura's effect. And then, you know, you can activate trap cards from your hand, so using stuff like Jar of Greed, Reckless Greed, which basically becomes like a Pot of Greed. And of course, Exchange of the Spirit. So the thought process behind the deck is super easy. It's super simple. It's super straightforward. Doesn't need too much thinking. The only thinking you need to do is to make sure that, and that's why stuff like Soul Release, also a very old school card, is in the deck, because let's say if you use like Card Destruction or Morphing Jar, your opponent will end up having cards in the graveyard, and that's something you definitely don't want to have, because again, the graveyard and deck will be switched for both players, that is, as soon as you activate Exchange of the Spirit. So again, you want to have like, or you want your opponent to have like 0 cards in the graveyard as soon as you activate Exchange of the Spirit, so they will end up with like 0 cards, and then, you know, you can just end your turn, and then your opponent will not have any cards in the deck to draw, and that's indeed like a loss, you know, will result in a loss. So that's why there are triple soul release. Yeah, did I say exchange? No, it's a soul release here in the deck to make sure that your opponent will not have any cards in the graveyard, right? So again, keep in mind, this is a deck from 2002. There's like a small report you can read in like the video description from like a tournament report on Road of the King, but I mean, I've been playing this game ever since 2004. I remember that this FTK again was not possible. FTK, OTK, personally, I don't think it was possible in a TCG. Again, by the time we actually got these cards, some cards were limited by the time. You know, Makyura, was it one, I believe, or was it immediately banned? Not really sure about that. But the only time that I ever heard about this deck back then was through, I believe it was through Shriek, a very old website for like OCG deck lists. And I was like, oh man, that looks so cool, so nostalgic if you look at it now. But it's degenerate. Like, it's so consistent with those two Gracefuls, notable Morphing Jar, the Cyber Jar. That's game for me, because again, Card Destruction, you know, I believe you're the ruling states, not again, feel free to correct me, but your opponent will now draw 1, and I believe I can just pass? Or does your opponent need to draw the same amount of cards they discarded for Card Destruction, and that would result in like an instant loss for them? But anyway, both ways would lead to my victory, right? This is a problem, and this is something that the deck has like, even though this is a deck from 2002, does have like a lot of similarities with like another like FTK strategy you might be familiar with, and that's Morphing Jar, or, you know, Jar FTK, Cyber Jar FTK. Both of them were at some point involved in like FTK, OTK shenanigans. Basically, both Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar always led to like FTK potential, right? Possibilities with like Book of Tayu, Book of Moon, reflipping your reborning your Morphing Jar, Cyber Jar from the graveyard with the Shallow Grave, the spell here, this one. Reborn it. Okay, your opponent needs to have a monster as well. That's like the small cost, I guess, the small downside, I guess, but it doesn't really matter too much. You definitely just want to reborn your Cyber Jar or Morphing Jar, put it in face down defense position, and then use stuff like Book of Tayu to immediately flip it face up and use the effect. And I mean, that's a similarity, I guess, with this deck and the deck like, or an FTK strategy that Cyber Jar FTK or, you know, Morphing Jar FTK was back then. You know, using stuff like card destruction and serial spell, right? So this was kinda a brick, and that's the thing with stuff like modern decks have, is the ability to, you know, slap in multiple hand traps, impermanence, mainly Ash Blossom, which is huge against this deck, negating a potential card destruction. Painful Choice, again, is definitely a bummer for this particular deck, and even though it's not really the instant game winner, but it could be. I mean, if you're drawing like this hand, like Soul Release, Shallow Grave, Book of Tayu, that's not good, right? That's not really the hand you want to have. That's the thing also with this deck, is you definitely want to go first. That's obvious. And you know, like look back in like the past. 2002 format is where, you know, like early Yu-Gi-Oh days, hardly any hand traps or potential disruption if your opponent started with this deck. Luckily, we TCG players were like, you know, like spared from this bullcrap. Yeah, that's basically the thing. But again, keep in mind, like that if you lost like a dice roll and your opponent started with this deck, there wasn't really anything you could do other than hope that your opponent like bricked, right? And even then, I mean, it's back then, or if you look at today's format, today's decks are like, okay, if I can get a turn, I can pump out multiple big beat sticks and go for game. Back then, that wasn't really the case, right? Just, you know, yeah, the normal summon was actually like your only summon for the turn, figure of speech. So yeah, going second now, and that's a problem. I mean, the thing now here is that with dinosaurs and, you know, like the Calamity's shenanigans, Trishula as well lost the card, being the Graceful Charity. That's a huge blow, especially now with that Rota as well. Rota leads to the only target being Makyura. But again, that's a 3-off here in this deck. Wasn't limited back then. I believe, if I remember correctly, Makyura, the Destructor, eventually got the errata. Was it back in 2020, right? I mean, very recently. It was Exchange of the Spirit that got its errata a couple of years ago in a TCG also. But yeah, I mean, we haven't seen them back then ever since they got their errata. With a lot of cards, right? I mean, a lot of old school cards got an errata, and after that, they, you know, didn't really see any play. So, not really a huge fan of errata, but that's not really the point of the video. So, going first, Pendulum Magicians, and first, use your traps. That's important because of the card destruction. You can set your spells and use them the same turn, unless of course they're a quick play spell, but you can't set your traps and use them in the same turn, even though with Makyura. So again, Cyber Jar, hopefully get the draw off, hopefully like no Ash Blossom, so I can still, you know, draw those cards. And I go for Cyber Jar instead of Morphing Jar, since obviously Morphing Jar lets your opponent discard cards, and you don't really want to fill up your opponent's graveyard. And the gimmick now is that I already have the Soul Release, so I can potentially banish like the 3 cards in my opponent's graveyard here. But I need to first of all fulfill the cost, well, quote-unquote cost, of my Exchange of the Spirit, is that before the errata, Exchange of the Spirit said that you needed to have at least 15 cards in your graveyard, while now, and again feel free to correct me, is that the errata states of Exchange of the Spirit is that both players need to have like 15 cards in their graveyard, and that's a big bummer, right? Especially now also with Makyura getting the errata, and now post-errata it's definitely not good. So pass the turn, and again your opponent is forced to draw a card, but again if they can't draw, that's game over. Last duel, right? Masterpiece deck. Going second this time. Asima opening hand, and that's decent. Double Upstart Goblin, and the Graceful Charity. So hopefully, you know, the next cards would like involve a Makyura or reinforcement of the armor to immediately trigger it, you know, like triggering Makyura by discarding it off of Graceful Charity, but let's hope that's the case. But anyway, so 2 sets that might be, you know, like can be everything, but the Masterpiece is potential interruption for the potential Cyber Jar here, and the 2 sets. What could it be? This is Masterpiece through Draco, so they weren't really playing the Floodgates as would as like a modern true Draco deck would play, with stuff like Monarchs, Erupt, Gozen, Match Rivalry, you know, that stuff. Not sure, Rivalry, not really Gozen, but anyway. So painful choice using the effect Get Makyura, but I think Makyura was already triggered to well, yeah, activate or in effect. So you eventually use card destruction, but the problem now is that I need to get rid of my opponent's graveyard, right? With Soul Release, but I need to draw my last copy of Exchange of the Spirit and 2 cards left. So set 1 card and okay, there it is, obviously. The Cyclone isn't really going to do anything again. Post-chain it will indeed be sent to the graveyard, but that's indeed too late, and I can sneak the win here, steal the win here. But I mean, Makyura FTK/OTK featuring Exchange of the Spirit, it's one of those nostalgic OTK FTK decks next to like Morphing Jar, Cyber Jar, FTK, OTK, Magical Scientist FTK. If you were a player back then, like those names were like the terror of the game. Last Turn FTK, also one of those decks that like has that big name. But let's say like if this deck would come back in today's format, would it be powerful or as powerful back then? Who knows, probably not, because, you know, like modern day of negation, going second, going first, hand traps and so on, the game is obviously different compared to it was back then. Okay, guys, feel free to leave a suggestion for the challenger appears. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a comment or like if you enjoyed the video. Lithium signing out. Peace.